Is there on off on there?
Okay, hi, welcome to Central. It's great that you are here or watching online, I think, back there. Not because you get a check mark on any kind of an attendance card, but because life can be really challenging, and hopefully whenever we come together and we gather together, we are all reminded that God loves us and He wants to fill us with strength to face each new day, and hope that can give us joy even in difficult situations. So it's good that you are here. Ben is not here, obviously. He is speaking tonight in Tulsa, and I'm not sure at another church or a gathering.
Yeah.
Okay.
At another church up there.
Okay.
Doing their summer series.
Oh, cool. So he's been asked to do that. So he's doing that. Celine and Ben very kindly thought that I might be able to help carry the torch tonight while he's gone. And I think it's because they know that C.S. Lewis is my favorite author, and Mere Christianity is my favorite book. The section that Ben, I typed it out too, word for word. I was afraid I would get up here and just forget everything I was going to say. So I'm going to try to do the look up, look down, but I just had to read it. So the section that Ben has been covering on Wednesday nights, he maybe has mentioned, but would say it's pretty small section that's kind of tucked into the middle, and it's been really good. I'm sure he would also encourage you to read the whole book. There's so much good stuff at the beginning, at the end, in the middle. So I've been going back through it over the past week, trying to really maybe pick like my very favorite analogy, and I just couldn't. Like, I thought, okay, this one, no this one, no this one, and even though he didn't necessarily ask me, I was like, I'll just tuck it in real quick because it's so good, but I couldn't come up with just one. There's so many truths that have really impacted me from this book, so I encourage you to read it. The chapter, he did prepare a video that is about to play. The chapter being covered tonight, it does have some challenging things to say. How to kind of preface it is I want to encourage you to have an open mind. I think the overall purpose of the chapter is to help us see that the brokenness of the world, combined with all of our life experiences and habits that we have formed, some good, some maybe not so good, when those intertwine with our faith, sometimes that creates a hybrid or kind of variant idea about what it looks like to follow Jesus. Sometimes we're not even fully aware of how different kind of cultural or worldly aspects have kind of fused with our faith. And so the process of figuring out how to separate faulty thinking from truth can be a really difficult process, and it can even be painful if it means acknowledging ways that we have been wrong. We don't usually like to think that maybe our thinking is wrong in some areas, but interestingly enough, C.S. Lewis says that the way that a lot of us are trying to live is actually harder than that separation process, even if it involves admitting you're wrong. A hybrid of kind of worldly pursuits and faith, it makes things feel really complicated. It makes following Jesus feel complicated. It's not always easy, but at its core, it's simple. But it can be really complicated, and it can also just make it hard to know what our purpose is each day, because we have these worldly pursuits and we're trying to fit that in with following Jesus, and so it can be really complicated. And it says, so for example, trying to pursue worldly goals and selfish ambition, kind of using this hand to represent that, while also trying to be good, he says that's impossible. He says it's like trying to teach an egg to fly. And he words it really funny, it makes me laugh. But he says it's like trying to teach an egg to fly. The process of hatching and becoming a bird, it might be difficult, but the end result is worth it. It leads to flying. The process of identifying ways that we have been wrong or that we may have misinterpreted the gospel and refocusing our heart and life on Jesus, it might be painful at first because it may not feel great at first because we tend not to like to admit when we're wrong. And so, but if admitting we're wrong or realizing perhaps where we need to refocus back to the truths of Jesus and the truths of God's love, then it's worth it 100%, even if it is painful to admit where we were wrong, because it leads us to the peace and the joy that we were made for. And and perhaps a freedom in our daily lives that could even feel like flying. So keep that bird analogy. A freedom that does not feel so burdened down by, what does everyone think of me? We want to follow Jesus and do that, but sometimes we add in all these pressures of how can I please people, and what do they think of me, and what if this? And so hopefully that can lead to freedom. And then maybe someday when this life is over and the real adventure begins, we'll maybe do some actual flying. So we're going to start the video. I encourage you to listen to C.S. Lewis and to listen to Ben. When I wrote that sentence, I thought, nobody tell Ben that we said listen to C.S. Lewis and Ben in the same sentence, because his head will just get so big. And ask God to give you kind of clarity of thought on how do we bring it back to Jesus? How do we simplify? How do we come back to him? And in the book, he says a lot so that you can experience the joy that you were made for. So thanks for letting me share just a little bit. He's got a great video, and then will help us in discussion. Susan.
In tonight's lesson, we're going to continue looking at mere morality, even though I can't be there in person. We're going to have a short video explaining what's going on in the chapter that we, in theory, would have read together. And then we're going to have a discussion afterward to let you express some views about it. The topic for tonight from Mere Christianity is a section that Lewis titles Social Morality. And there are a couple of questions that are leading to what Lewis writes, where he's really not keen on Christianity, would want to know, what are you really after here, you Christians, with your morality? What are you trying to do to the culture and society that we live in? What do you expect to happen in our country, in England, if you're C.S. Lewis, or here in America? We ask the same set of questions. So three basic questions we're looking for answers for tonight. First, are Christians preaching a new morality? Is Christian morality something utterly distinct from everything else that we're asking you to give up whatever morality you have in favor of ours? Second, are Christians trying to create a Christian society? Other words that are important there we'll get to at the end of the lesson. Are we trying to create a Christian state? Are we trying to create a Christian community? Just what are we trying to build here on the social level? And then once we figure that out, the question is, what would that even look like, and how would we do it? I don't know that a lot of people have given as much thought as somebody like Lewis has to what would it even mean to say we're just going to make the New Testament our constitution. If we were just going to have a Christian society, whatever that might be, how would we make that work?
Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Social morality. The first thing to get clear about Christian morality between man and man is that in this department, Christ did not come to preach any brand new morality. The golden rule of the New Testament, do as you would be done by, is a summing up of what everyone at bottom had always known to be right. Really great moral teachers never do introduce new moralities. It is quacks and cranks who do that. As Dr. Johnson said, people need to be reminded more often than they need to be instructed. The real job of every moral teacher is to keep on bringing us back, time after time, to the old simple principles which we are all so anxious not to see. Like bringing a horse back and back to the fence it has refused to jump, or bringing a child back and back to the bit in its lesson that it wants to shirk. The second thing to get clear is that Christianity has not and does not profess to have a detailed political program for applying do as you would be done by to a particular society at a particular moment. It could not have. It is meant for all men at all times. And the particular program which suited one place or time would not suit another. And anyhow, that is not how Christianity works. When it tells you to feed the hungry, it does not give you lessons in cookery. When it tells you to read the scriptures, it does not give you lessons in Hebrew and Greek or even in English grammar. It was never intended to replace or supersede the ordinary human arts and sciences. It is rather a director which will set them all to the right jobs, and a source of energy which will give them all new life, if only they will put themselves at its disposal. People say, the church ought to give us a lead. That is true if they mean it in the right way, but false if they mean it in the wrong way. By the church, they ought to mean the whole body of practicing Christians. And when they say that the church should give us a lead, they ought to mean that some Christians, those who happen to have the right talents, should be economists and statesmen, and that all economists and statesmen should be Christians, and that their whole efforts in politics and economics should be directed to putting do as you would be done by into action. If that happened, and if we others were really ready to take it, then we should find the Christian solution for our own social problems pretty quickly. But of course, when they ask for a lead from the church, most people mean they want the clergy to put out a political program. That is silly. The clergy are those particular people within the whole church who have been specially trained and set aside to look after what concerns us as creatures who are going to live forever. And we are asking them to do a quite different job for which they have not been trained. The job is really on us, on the layman. The application of Christian principles, say, to trade unionism or education, must come from Christian trade unionists and Christian schoolmasters, just as Christian literature comes from Christian novelists and dramatists. Not from the bench of bishops getting together and trying to write plays and novels in their spare time. All the same, the New Testament, without going into details, gives us a pretty clear hint of what a fully Christian society would be like. Perhaps it gives us more than we can take. It tells us that there are to be no passengers or parasites. If a man does not work, he ought not to eat. Everyone is to work with his own hands, and what is more, everyone's work is to produce something good. There will be no manufacture of silly luxuries, and then of sillier advertisements to persuade us to buy them. And there is to be no swank or side, no putting on airs. To that extent, a Christian society would be what we now call leftist. On the other hand, it is always insisting on obedience. Obedience and outward marks of respect from all of us to properly appointed magistrates, from children to parents, and, I'm afraid this is going to be very unpopular, from wives to husbands. Thirdly, it is to be a cheerful society, full of singing and rejoicing, and regarding worry or anxiety as wrong. Courtesy is one of the Christian virtues, and the New Testament hates what it calls busybodies. If there were such a society in existence and you or I visited it, I think we should come away with a curious impression. We should feel that its economic life was very socialistic and in that sense advanced, but that its family life and its code of manners were rather old-fashioned, perhaps even ceremonious and aristocratic. Each of us would like some bits of it, but I'm afraid very few of us would like the whole thing. That is just what one would expect if Christianity is the total plan for the human machine. We have all departed from that total plan in different ways, and each of us wants to make out that his own modification of the original plan is the plan itself. You will find this again and again about anything that is really Christian. Everyone is attracted by bits of it and wants to pick out those bits and leave the rest. That is why we do not get much further. And that is why people who are fighting for quite opposite things can both say they are fighting for Christianity. Now another point. There is one bit of advice given to us by the ancient heathen Greeks, and by the Jews in the Old Testament, and by the great Christian teachers of the Middle Ages, which the modern economic system has completely disobeyed. All these people told us not to lend money at interest, and lending money at interest, what we call investment, is the basis of our whole system. Now, it may not absolutely follow that we are wrong. Some people say that when Moses and Aristotle and the Christians agreed in forbidding interest, or usury as they called it, they could not foresee the joint stock company, and were only thinking of the private moneylender, and that therefore we need not bother about what they said. That is a question I cannot decide on. I am not an economist, and I simply do not know whether the investment system is responsible for the state we are in or not. This is where we want the Christian economist. But I should not have been honest if I had not told you that 3 great civilizations had agreed, or so it seems at first sight, in condemning the very thing on which we have based our whole life. One more point, and I'm done. In the passage where the New Testament says that everyone must work, it gives as a reason, in order that he may have something to give to those in need. Charity, giving to the poor, is an essential part of Christian morality. In the frightening parable of the sheep and the goats, it seems to be the point on which everything turns. Some people nowadays say that charity ought to be unnecessary, and that instead of giving to the poor, we ought to be producing a society in which there were no poor to give to. They may be quite right in saying that we ought to produce that kind of society, but if anyone thinks that as a consequence you can stop giving in the meantime, then he has parted company with all Christian morality. I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I am afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc. is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. If our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say they are too small. There ought to be things we should like to do and cannot do because our charitable expenditure excludes them. I am speaking now of charities in the common way. Particular cases of distress among your own relatives, friends, neighbors, or employees, which God, as it were, forces upon your notice, may demand much more, even to the crippling and endangering of your own position. For many of us, the great obstacle to charity lies not in our luxurious living or desire for more money, but in our fear of insecurity. This must often be recognized as a temptation. Sometimes our pride also hinders our charity. We are tempted to spend more than we ought on the showy forms of generosity, tipping, hospitality, and less than we ought on those who really need our help. And now, before I end, I'm going to venture on a guess as to how this section has affected any who have heard it. My guess is that there are some leftist people among them who are very angry that it has not gone further in that direction, and some people of an opposite sort who are angry because they think it has gone much too far. If so, that brings us right up against the real snag in all this drawing up of blueprints for a Christian society. Most of us are not really approaching the subject in order to find out what Christianity says. We are approaching it in the hope of finding support from Christianity for the views of our own party. We are looking for an ally where we are offered either a master or a judge. I am just the same. There are bits in this section that I wanted to leave out. And that is why nothing whatever is going to come of such talks unless we go a much longer way round. A Christian society is not going to arrive until most of us really want it. And we are not going to want it until we become fully Christian. I may repeat, "Do as you would be done by," till I am black in the face, but I cannot really carry it out till I love my neighbor as myself. And I cannot learn to love my neighbor as myself till I learn to love God. And I cannot learn to love God except by learning to obey Him. And so, as I warned you, we are driven on to something more inward, driven on from social matters to religious matters. For the longest way round is the shortest way home.
So first off, on the question of are Christians proposing a new morality, he wants to say right up front, Christ did not come to preach any brand new morality. Really great moral teachers never do introduce new moralities. It's quacks and cranks who do that. His basic idea is that when you read the teachings of Jesus, not anything really revolutionary except perhaps in the degree to which Christ will apply it. He takes everything further, but in terms of which things were right and which things are wrong, which things were good and which things were bad, there's nothing really new. He's don't lie, be faithful to your spouse, don't murder, don't be violent, don't hate, don't be greedy. That's not novel. He's not reinventing morality. In fact, last week in our class, we even noticed that this sounds a little bit like Aristotle. I mean, this is the same stuff an ancient Greek would have said, yeah, it's basically how morality works. There are some areas where there would be some disagreement, but in basic outline, yeah, Christ is saying the same things are wrong that you probably thought were wrong. And that is comforting in a sense. Furthermore, Lewis will go to a second point and say Christianity has not and does not profess to have a detailed political program for applying "do as you would be done by" to a particular society at a particular moment. It could not have. So on the one hand, Lewis wants to say Christianity has morality that he's talking about in this section, but it's not drastically different than what morally good people have pretty well always thought. We can, kind of finesse that point a little bit and say, well, a little more here and a little more there. But in general, right and wrong are more or less in the same places as they've been throughout most of human history. On the other hand, Christianity is not professing a political regime. There's not a system of government built into Christian teaching, Christian ethics. That one is a point of some controversy because every Christian in history has wanted their preferred system of government to be the one Jesus likes. So if you're pro-democracy, you say, well, Jesus obviously would have favored democracy. That's, the way. If you're pro-monarchy, well, obviously, Jesus, would have favored the monarchy. Whatever it is, you want Jesus on your side if you're a Christian. And so for many, 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 many years, Christians have said, this is how Christian government and policy and social structure would work. The same for economics. Well, obviously Jesus would have been a capitalist. Oh no, obviously Jesus would have been a socialist. And everyone's got this thought of how Jesus would apply these things. And what Lewis says is, if you read it carefully, if you really look at the text, Jesus just doesn't give you that kind of details. Do as you would you would be done by, which is a funny summary in my thinking. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. how do you put that into law? What's the tax policy based on that? What's the speed limit if that's the law? I don't know. It's not obvious to me that there is a political design that comes out of that, which is Lewis's point. So he says, yeah, we believe as Christians that the church should lead in a society. That's what we mean, according to Lewis. A Christian society is one where the values of the church take the lead in the structuring of the society. Now, he's quick to say, I don't mean our clergy should be writing our laws. In fact, he's quite clear, we'd be really bad at it. Clergy should not be writing laws. The church government should not be the state government. He's not a fan of that. But what he does believe is we'll get the best out of our society when we take the principles of Christianity and put them into practice in every facet of life. He believes laymen, not clergy, but church members, Christian people, will be the best at applying Christian morality to whatever part of society they work in. So, for example, he says Christians should be economists and statesmen. In fact, all economists and statesmen should be Christian. Like, that would be the best case scenario. I don't want my archbishop writing my policy, but I do want the guy who writes the policy to share a Christian worldview and faith. And that's what Lewis means by the church taking the lead and being creating a Christian society. It's not a Christian state per se, but rather it's a society informed by and built on a Christian worldview. He says that would be ideal, and that's, in his mind, the goal of what Christians should want for a society. Okay, so let's take that at face value and say, what would that look like then? What would a Christian society actually look like? I don't know if you've ever really tried to think about that. In the Old Testament, the law of Moses was structured in such a way where it really was the civil code. I mean, there was no distinction between what was instructed in the code book in the Torah and national law. They were one and the same. Today, I'm trying to think of a good example. I don't know if there is a good example, but an example might be Iran takes their particular interpretation of Islam, the Quran, and Sharia principles and says that's our national code, more or less. What would it look like to take the New Testament and say that's the rule book, that's the laws of our country, or even principles out of the Old Testament and inform them through the New Testament? How would you even do that? And it's not obvious that you could or that we'd like it if we did. Do we want to outlaw idolatry? Do we actually want to put people to death who practice idolatry? Well, most of us would be a little queasy about that. I mean, I don't like idolatry. It's wrong. It's sinful. But do I want to criminalize it? In our country, we've said no. We're going to create freedom for Christians to be Christians and for idol worshipers to worship idols, if that's what they want to do. One freedom protects both groups. So is that what the New Testament tells us? Where is that in the New Testament? It's not obvious. And so that's Lewis's point, that it's going to be really tough if you're trying to make a Christian state. The most we can do is work towards a Christian society, and even that is going to be difficult. What's it going to look like? Here's a few suggestions. 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 10 says, "Now we command you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness and not in accord with the tradition that you received from us. For even when we were with you, we would give you this command: if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat." Okay, so first off, Lewis says, Christian society would be built on a work ethic. No passengers, no parasites. If man does not work, he ought not eat. That's a Christian value. Okay, so a whole society of hardworking people. Okay. On the other hand, 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 10, he doesn't mention this passage specifically, but I thought it applied. I desire that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise, the women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. Lewis would say, well, we're going to have to apply verses like that too, which would say, not the gender part of it, actually. That's not what he's interested in there. He wants to talk about the gold and the pearls and costly apparel. Christians really don't go in for luxuries, at least not absurd luxuries. I mean, you have to decide what those are. But at some level, Christians are people who are satisfied and content with what they have. We're not... in capitalism, there's always this idea of make something better and charge more for it. Christians don't really buy into that. At least they shouldn't. So a Christian society, Lewis said, would have no manufacturer of silly luxuries and then of sillier advertisements to persuade us to buy them. No putting on airs. Like in a Christian society, we'd all just be common folk. Well, okay, how would we do that? Keep it going. Hebrews 13:17, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. That particular verse that I put on the screen probably references church leadership and elders and so forth. But there are certainly passages in Scripture, like in the book of Romans and in 1 Peter, that reference the importance of submitting to your government leaders, kings, governors, those who are in authority and so forth. And so Lewis says a Christian society is always insisting on obedience. We're people who follow the rules, follow the laws. That's the kind of people we're supposed to be. So that would be a feature of a Christian society. On the other hand, if you keep reading that verse we just read, let them do this with joy and not with groaning. Or we could quote from Philippians, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. While on the one hand, we're structured and orderly. On the other hand, we're happy people. Christians, he says it's to be a cheerful society, full of singing and rejoicing and regarding worry or anxiety as wrong. Like we just don't even practice in anxiety or worry. If in a Christian society, you just see people singing hymns, walking up and down the street on the way to the grocery store, where they would buy very plain goods, which they would be content with, and no silly luxuries. Okay. What kind of society is this? Is Lewis's point of it's not probably what we imagined when you said, I want a Christian country. You probably thought of a couple of key Christian social debates and said, I want those to be settled. He said, if we really tried it, it would be different than any of us are expecting. Interesting question for you. Is Lewis's vision a right-wing or left-wing society? Secret is neither. It's everyone works hard at their own task. That kind of, I'm putting a character out there, a caricature. This isn't meant to be really lofty political discernment here, but just for the point of an argument, everyone works hard at their own task. Kind of sounds like Republican rhetoric of hard work and everybody does their own job and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But at the same time, we have an economically equal society where we don't put on airs and no one dresses too fancy or shows above anybody else that they're wealthy. Classless society, that kind of sounds leftist to me. Full of law and order, we all submit to rules. Well, law and order language has been kind of Republican language for a lot of years. In their campaign ads and things like that, you hear a lot of law and order language. But also joy and happiness and contentment and freedom and openness to go out and enjoy your life and be content with whatever. I don't know. Is that conservative? I don't know. So his point is none of the above. Like if you were writing a campaign ad based on a Christian worldview, I'm not sure if either party could run it because it just doesn't really match up with the political setting of his world half a century ago or of ours today. In fact, he goes on to say, we should feel that its economic life was very socialistic, but that its family life and its code of manners were rather old-fashioned, perhaps even ceremonious and aristocratic. Which one is it? Is this a conservative society or a liberal society? Are we socialist or are we aristocrat? He says, yeah, it's going to feel in different parts like one or the other. Each of us, he says, would like some bits of it, but I am afraid very few of us would like the whole thing. That is why people who are fighting for quite opposite things can both say they are fighting for Christianity. And that's the big point that he's trying to warn us about, is that everybody, in a world where Christianity is popular, now, in our setting today where Christianity is increasingly less popular, it doesn't matter as much to present yourself and your views as Christian to get popular opinion on your side in politics. But in a world where it did, he says everybody's going to tell you their idea is a Christian idea, and probably part of it is, but not all of it. And not all the things that are Christian are in their ideas. So let's just take a second and try to consider some examples, because Lewis isn't going to leave this in the abstract. He says, let's take some examples of some ideas Christians, in theory, would believe in, but probably aren't prepared to adopt in our society. What is an example of a Christian ideal we wouldn't like if our society operated on it? This comes from the Old Testament, but it's pretty consistent in the Old Testament. Exodus 22:25, if you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. Interest. You can't loan money at interest. And this is repeated in Leviticus 25. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food at profit. Okay, pretty straightforward. Almost, I don't know if, depends how you want to take it, almost runs against the if you won't work, you don't eat point of view from Thessalonians. Here it's, that doesn't mean you let people starve because they're poor, and you definitely don't profit on them. You see, that's kind of the counterpoint. Deuteronomy 23:19 and 20, you shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. So they were allowed to do it to people outside the country, but not to fellow Israelites. Well, how would you apply that principle to a Christian society? If a person goes to church, you can't charge them interest. Does this apply to public joint ventures or only to private money lenders? Can the bank, if the guy at the bank is a Christian and I'm a Christian, can he charge me interest on my mortgage? Can I buy stock in a company that sells credit cards if I know that I'm making money based on the interest they charge poor people? How would a Christian ever practice banking in our society of any kind? Like if you have money in a CD, if you have money in a savings account, you get paid interest for letting the bank hang on to your money. But what are they doing with your money? They're loaning it to somebody else at interest, which is the thing they're not supposed to be doing according to these passages, right? If you were to just take them very literally. Who would decide how to apply this to modern economics? Who wants to settle this one for us and tell us how to live by it? How many of our problems today stem from this practice? I mean, how much of our economic woes are tied up into credit card debt, interest rates, and things like that? C.S. Lewis admits, he says, I don't know the answer. Well, that's not fair. If you can make a problem, you got to tell us the answer. He says, no, I don't know the answer. And that's his point, that applying Christian principles to society has never been easy to understand just exactly how it would work. Our entire economic structure today in America and Great Britain in days gone by is based on lending at interest. It's how the system works. I don't know how to make it work without that. Lewis says, that is a question I cannot decide on. But I should not have been honest if I had not told you that Jewish and Christian history had agreed in condemning the very thing on which we have based our whole life. So his point again is, we in principle want a Christian society. There are going to be places where we're not even sure how to do it on the big scale. Like on a personal level, it's a little simpler. But when we get any bigger than one person trying to apply this to a society, it gets messy in a hurry. You say, oh, I don't like that one. Give me a different example. I'm not sure about that interest thing. He gives another one. How about just giving in general? Ephesians 4:28, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor doing honest work with his own hands so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. So just like we said before, Christian society would be based on hard work and work ethic. But Christian society is also based on the premise that you work hard so that you can have extra to give away. Well, that's not how our system works. In our system, the way we live, you work hard, you have a little extra, and then you spend it on yourself, and you enjoy some of those luxuries that Lewis says we're not supposed to have. Scripture says, well, when you have extra, you give it away. Do we want to mandate giving in a Christian society? And how much? How much are we going to tell people they absolutely have to give no matter what? And how are we going to do that? Lewis says, I don't believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. And if our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say they are too small. That's not going to be a popular idea. You know, base a society on giving until you're uncomfortable. That's the rule. So Lewis's point, again, over and over again, is figuring out what a Christian society would look like is going to be tricky. And he does not even pretend to have the answers, especially as it applies to economics, but we could talk about other areas as well. And he admits that pretty much no one's going to like anything he's said so far. I love this little section. He says, some leftist people among them who are very angry that it has not gone further in that direction, and some people of an opposite sort who are angry because they think it has gone much too far. He says, if you really proposed a Christian system of society, your liberals would be mad it's not liberal enough, and your conservatives would be mad that it's way too liberal. No one would like it because Christianity does not fit into the political boxes that have developed in modern society, and maybe they never have. And then he goes a step further, and this is where it starts to sting. He says, most of us are not really approaching the subject in order to find out what Christianity says. We're approaching it in hope of finding some support from Christianity for the views of our own party. Ouch. He says, all too often, we go to the Bible looking for some agreement with what my political party thinks is true. That just nearly prophetic. I mean, he wrote that, again, half a century ago or more. And it's more true today. In years gone by, there were some studies done of what were you afraid your son or daughter, what kind of person they might marry? Like, what if they bring someone home for dinner and they say, I'm engaged, what did you worry about that person? Half a century ago, the most common answer was different religion. What if they bring home a Catholic and I'm a Protestant? What if they bring home a Jewish person? The second place, I think, was race. What if they bring home someone of a different race? Today, the most common answer is different political party. That I am deeply concerned, apparently, is what studies tell us. We're all deeply concerned that if I'm a Democrat, my daughter will marry a Republican, or vice versa. And so we're so deeply entrenched on our political ideologies that we then go to our religion just for backup. And Lewis says, and that's the problem. And I would say, since Lewis said this, it's only gotten worse. And then the punchiest quote of them all: we were looking for an ally where we were offered a master or a judge. Christ is not your political ally. He is your master, he is your Lord, and in the end, he'll be the judge of whether you did it well or not. Turning his system of right and wrong into political punchlines and mottos and bumper stickers is not going to cut it. And that's Lewis's point. That's kind of how the chapter ends then. I want to just add a little of my own commentary of what I think about what Lewis said. One critique or criticism I've had of this chapter is that Lewis isn't really careful in distinguishing what he means by a Christian society. we might think of three different ideas. You could have a Christian state, again, like a theocracy, where literally the church runs the state top down. Head of the church is the head of the state, whole thing. Probably Lewis is not fond of that. I think if you read the chapter, you come away with he's not on board with that. And most of us in modern world would not be. It's gone badly, okay? Well, then we kind of want a Christian society, but what does that look like? If it's not run by religion from the top down, where does religion enter the picture? And that's not entirely clear to me what Lewis has in mind of how that would operate. And what he doesn't discuss very much is the idea of a Christian community, that maybe these principles that he's discussing just aren't made for national application. They're made for people in community to live by. And this whole nationalization of the system of trying to figure out how to run a government based on it was maybe never what Christ had in mind. This has traditionally been what churches of Christ have thought. Sometimes. Churches of Christ have been all over the place on most subjects, so you could find somebody on any opinion. But at times, at least, churches of Christ taught the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century especially, that the church operates outside of and even against civil society. David Lipscomb, I think I've mentioned before, prominent preacher out of Tennessee, end of the 19th century, believed civil government came from Babel and was inherently evil. He says, if you want to know about government, go to the Tower of Babel. He taught that Christians should do the minimum required to submit to government. You pay your taxes, you obey your reasonable laws, no more. You don't vote, no military service, nothing else. You don't engage in it. Because his thought was, that is always going to be something I have no time or interest in, that government stuff. But in our small communities, we can behave like Christians and we can do this right. And that was his dream. I don't know if that works either, because that seems... My criticism of his view, David Lipscomb's view, was that seems to just give the country over to heathens, to say, we're all going to step out of it. I like Lewis's point that wouldn't we like statesmen to be Christians? Wouldn't we like statesmen or economic professors to be Christians and talk about economics from a Christian point of view? Wouldn't we like the people in charge to at least be informed by a Christian worldview? So I think that's the challenge of this chapter and of the subject generally, is we're trying to find some way to build a culture on a Christian worldview when the Christian worldview doesn't offer us a detailed government program. So how do you build it from the grassroots up is the challenge. And Lewis openly admits it's a hard one. I like this chapter. It's thought-provoking and challenging. It makes you really think about what we want. When we say things like, we need a Christian nation, I think Lewis makes you say, what would that even mean? And do we really? And that's tough. It doesn't answer any of my questions, but it makes me think a lot. So I leave you with that and some discussion questions for you to kick around. Do we want a Christian state? I think sometimes we will say we do. I don't know that we really do. Would we, if we were offered a theocracy, like the head of the church will be the head of the government and it will be Christian from the top down, would we like that? Charlemagne, Charles the Great, said, it's real simple. We're going to put a sword on your neck, you're going to be baptized, or we're going to execute you. He had a lot of converts. And that's a top-down Christian theocracy. I don't think it's what we want. Do we want a Christian society? If so, do we really mean we want our economics based on Christian principles? Are we going to rewrite banking laws? Are we going to change the way we buy and sell goods? Are we going to stop buying luxuries and start giving away our excess to the poor? I mean, are we going to build that into the system? Okay. Well, will we settle for a Christian community? Everybody's in favor of a Christian community, but are we going to say that's the best we can hope for, that's all we can get, and no more? Is that it? Is that what we can do? Is that the best we can hope for? Are any of these ideas practically possible? Is there anything we can do about it? How cynical do you want to be today? How do we do it? How do we influence the culture? I'm not there to slap your hands with a ruler. I'm leaving someone else in charge with hand-slapping power, but I will give you this disclaimer, this warning, because I know this deals with a little bit of politics. Be careful in the discussion, be kind, and don't be smearing your political opponents in your discussion. Keep it Christian, please. That would be the opposite of Lewis's point. This is not a chapter that says Republicans are right or Democrats are right or anybody's right. It's more of a question of, can we apply Christian ideas to the world we live in on a large scale? And if so, how would we do that? And I'm curious what ideas you come up with. Be civilized. Thank you, guys.
Okay, well, I think we've got all of 5 minutes to talk about that. Did he have a slide with those questions on it, Susan? Oh, you're good. No. Rusty, we've only got 5 minutes, Rusty. We've only got 5 minutes. Okay, rather than going through all these, do you have if you have something or a thought or a comment about any one of these questions, throw it out. We'll get some semblance of a discussion started here.
For children running and screaming. What do you think?
It's a small point, but I don't know if we should be saying do or should. Should we want a Christian state rather than do we want?
What's
Should we
the
want a Christian
difference there?
society rather than do?
I don't know that we even could want a Christian state, considering if we believe that the local church is autonomous. I don't even know how you would get there in the first place.
Yeah.
Now, as a society or community, honestly, would I want a Christian society? This could be a lot harder than it is now. But in our current state today, I don't think it's going to be feasible anytime soon.
Yeah,
So community.
Any Christian parent, right, that has raised kids or is currently raising kids, who wishes for certain things, and certainly we have to agree with that, coming down to home from Delaware. So then, when we settle for a Christian community, there's a lot of challenges for those first two there, I think, and historically have shown any problems and challenges for those ideas. What should a Christian community look like? What kind of influence? How far should an influence of a Christian community go?
I think that's a good question, especially, we might need to use another word besides Christian, because as he pointed out, some people say, well, this is what Christians do, other people say, this is what, and so the term Christian has a different definition in a Christ-focused community. I know it's just semantics, but when you say Christian, everyone has an idea of what that is, rather than what does Christ really call us to in that community. And it would be drastically different.
It's interesting, I don't know if he chose the word settle on purpose to kind of make us think about that, but, perhaps that is, the best way instead of settling. I mean, if we can create that, perhaps that's the best way, seems biblically, that is the best way to reach people who are hurting or broken or struggling or don't know about Jesus, that when we are functioning as a thriving church that's trying to practice love and generosity towards each other, then that would be the witness to go out. So,
it feels like to me that Ada is a little bit a different kind of community than a lot of other towns that I've heard of. There's not that many towns I've ever heard of that reached out to churches or schools and invite churches in to pray over their school or help them with things and reach out to them for needs for students. And it feels like we have more of a partnership with other believers in the community than, of course, it's not like I know a lot of other towns, but it just feels like we've crossed lines that I didn't think would be crossed. And I think it's been a good thing.
That's a good point. On the other hand, having lived in Portland, Oregon for 15 years, think what you want about Portland, Oregon. That exact thing happened there, and we lived there. The mayor was in partnership with area churches, and it became kind of almost a status symbol for the city government to be involved with the churches. So it is happening other places. I think Lewis's real point, and especially in the last chapter, is that this has to kind of be an inward thing. We have to develop our inward qualities and characteristics before any of this can grow beyond.
And then past that,
I have to be a Christian man, and then I can start thinking about beyond.
right, and then you.
Yeah,
can
but
start
until I
thinking
get
about, right, yeah.
right, and that may be the biggest job of all for us.
Yeah.
And I think also when I think of do we want a Christian state, I'm also thinking we want to preserve our freedom to worship every day or once a week or at a church building without persecution. When that's not what everyone has.
Sure. Definitely presents a lot of challenges.
And then how are you going to do that? I mean, everyone has to find a way.
Right. To get an entire society to buy in on these are the rules that we're going to follow. Quite tricky.
Acts 2:44. All who believed were together, had all things in common, sold their possessions and goods, divided them among all as anyone had need. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. Before that says, they follow the apostles' doctrine, daily in prayer together and thanksgiving. Do we want to give up what it would take to do that much?
Right. Not everybody's going to be in agreement, right? And I think he was going there with the giving. He said, if you're not giving to an uncomfortable amount, then we should rethink that. I remember reading that. That was done a little bit.
He wants to get together every day.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to what's stopping us from having a Christian society now. And we, in the United States, we live in a free country with all these freedoms. We could do what we're saying now. The only difference would be, if it's run by the state, then we get to judge others more. And that's exactly the opposite of what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be focusing on ourselves. So I find that it's kind of a fun thought.
Anybody else, real quick? 7:38, so 34. Can't tell time. It's an annual clock. Did we solve everything like we always do? Leave it to Ben to leave, and we talk about politics and everything. Super
Let's
cool.
just not bring up names.
It's joyful, the picture of the early church. I mean,
Yeah.
that seems joyful to me.
Talking to my students from China, when we talk with them, their government's very hostile against Christians, but they see the church growing and Christianity spreading like wildfire, not because they're trying to make a Chinese Christian government, but because people are seeing something radically different in these people, because they can't go out and actually share. So these people start asking them, what makes you different? Why are you doing that?
Amazing how Christianity flourishes under Russia.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Blake encourages me about that when I get worried about the state of the world. Like, oh no, for our kids, and he just
Okay. All right. If you have any more questions,